The stale air in the tiny apartment was a suffocating mix of cheap cleaning fluid and the persistent, damp smell of urban decay. A single tap dripped a maddening, rhythmic torture into the sink. Ilara, only 42 but feeling a century old, sat at the kitchen table, her fingers raw and pricked from a lifetime of sewing. The grief for her husband, Daniel, was no longer a sharp, piercing pain, but a dull, heavy weight that settled in her bones. A constant companion since the construction accident 6 months ago. A suspicious accident that left her with a mountain of medical bills and a void in her life. She felt her chest tighten, a familiar knot of pure, undiluted fear. She glanced at the worn wallet on the table. Inside was less than $200. From the other room, she heard the soft, dry cough of her 10-year-old son, Leo. Each sound was a hammer blow against her already fractured resolve. The world had shrunk to this dim, desperate room, and she was failing within it. Her gaze fell upon the letter lying next to the wallet. It wasn't just paper, it was a verdict, the eviction notice. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the stark, red letters of the words, "Final notice to vacate." The cheap paper felt cold and brittle, a harbinger of the homelessness it promised. Her stomach plummeted, a sickening lurch as she remembered the landlord's voice from yesterday. Not cruel, just utterly indifferent. Business is business. Her eyes scanned the room, lingering on the faded floral sofa where she and Daniel used to watch movies, the threadbare rug where Leo took his first steps. These weren't possessions. They were the last artifacts of a life that had been stolen from her piece by piece. Now, they were just junk, destined for a curb. A distant siren wailed in the concrete canyon outside, and for a terrifying moment, Ilara felt it was wailing for her. A cold sweat beaded on her upper lip as the reality of her situation closed in. The gnawing ache in her stomach was a constant reminder of her sacrifice. It wasn't just grief, it was the sharp, biting pain of hunger. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, stretching the last of the bread and a small carton of milk for Leo, whose growing body needed it more. A persistent dizziness clouded her thoughts, a light-headed fog that made it hard to focus. She felt weak, brittle. Her eyes drifted to her sewing machine, sitting cold and silent in the corner under a thin shroud of dust. Its rhythmic hum, once a comforting soundtrack to her life and work, was now a sound of the past. The silence was an accusation. In a city gasping for breath, no one had money for tailored clothes or mended seams. She felt her throat constrict, a lump of unshed tears and unspoken panic lodging there. A single thought echoed in the crushing silence of the room. I am utterly and completely alone. The walls felt like they were breathing in, squeezing the last bit of air from her lungs. Leo was the reason she hadn't shattered completely, and also the source of her most profound terror. She heard the floorboards in his small bedroom creak as he shifted, the soft, shuffling sound of a boy trying to make himself invisible, to be less of a burden. At just 10 years old, he had the weary quietness of an old man. The questions had stopped weeks ago. He no longer asked when Dad was coming home from the hospital. He no longer asked why she cried at night when she thought he was asleep. The innocence had been burned out of him, leaving a solemn watchfulness that broke her heart a little more each day. A wave of profound nausea washed over her. How could she look into those eyes, his father's eyes, and tell him they had failed? That soon they wouldn't even have this small, damp room to call their own? Her own breath hitched in her chest. She hugged her arms around her thin frame, a desperate, futile gesture to keep herself from splintering into a million pieces right there on the cold linoleum floor. With a deep, shuddering breath, she finally reached for the wallet. Daniel's wallet. Its worn leather was soft beneath her trembling fingers. She tipped its contents onto the scarred wooden table. The sound was pathetic. A few crumpled bills, a sad little pile of coins that rolled and settled with a faint, tinny clink. She methodically smoothed the bills, 1 20, 2 10s, 4 5s, a stack of singles. She counted the change, $187.42. That was the sum total of her world. The precise number separating her son from the cold, unforgiving pavement. She stared at it, the money seeming to mock her. It wasn't a safety net. It was the last grain of sand in the hourglass. Tears she had held back for days finally broke free, hot and silent, carving clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. The last ember of hope inside her was extinguished, leaving nothing but cold, dark ash. Her body convulsed with a silent, gut-wrenching sob. The only sound in a world that had abandoned her. Just when the silence in the room had become a tangible presence, a solid weight pressing down on her, there was a sharp rap on the door. It was the mailman, his footsteps retreating down the hallway with an indifferent shuffle. Among the usual junk mail and final bills was a single, crisp envelope. It was thick, creamy-colored paper, heavy and official. Her name and address were typed, not handwritten. The return address was for a law firm in a town she'd never heard of, Shadow Ridge. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. She assumed it was another creditor, this one more formal than the rest. With trembling fingers, she tore it open. The paper inside was just as heavy. The scent of expensive ink and old archives rose from the page. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text, her mind struggling to process the words. Then, 2 words leaped out at her. Electrifying and impossible. Sole inheritance. She felt a jolt, a strange, disbelieving shock that momentarily silenced the gnawing fear in her gut. She collapsed back into her chair, the letter shaking in her hand. She read it again, her lips moving silently, tracing the foreign words. A great-aunt, someone she only vaguely remembered as a name whispered by her parents long ago, had passed away. And she, Elara, was her sole heir. The inheritance wasn't money. A deep, bitter part of her had known that would be too easy, but property, a house, a small cabin and the land it sat on in the remote mountain town of Shadow Ridge. It was the only thing the old woman had owned. The lawyer's words were clear. It was hers, free and clear. A house. The words echoed in the hollow space inside her. It wasn't a solution. It was a lifeline, a fragile, frayed rope thrown into the abyss she was drowning in. For the first time in months, a feeling she couldn't identify, a painful, sharp pang of something like hope, pierced through the thick fog of her despair. It hurt. It felt dangerous, but it was there. The decision was made in a fever dream of desperate activity. There was no other choice. It was the cabin or the street. She sold what little they had left, the worn floral sofa, her silent sewing machine, Daniel's old tools, for a fraction of their worth. Each transaction was a small death, another piece of their old life stripped away and converted into the cash they needed for the bus tickets. The sound of the coins dropping into her palm was a grim, metallic reminder of their flight. The final act was locking the apartment door for the last time. The click of the lock was unnervingly loud, a definitive sound that severed them from their past. She picked up their one overstuffed suitcase, its cheap cardboard sides bulging. Leo slipped his small, trusting hand into hers. His palm was sweaty. He didn't say a word, just stared at the door. Together, they walked away, the cacophony of the city, the sirens, the endless traffic, the distant shouts, feeling like the roars of a beast they were finally escaping. The bus ride was an exhausting, rattling ordeal that stretched on for 2 days. The air inside was a thick, recycled mixture of diesel fumes, cheap air freshener, and the faint, sour smell of too many bodies in a confined space. Elara's muscles ached, her entire body vibrating with the low, constant drone of the engine. She stared out the smudged window, watching the dense, concrete towers of the city bleed into sprawling suburbs, then flat, monotonous highways lined with skeletal trees. It felt like they were traveling through a grey, washed-out world. Beside her, Leo was a silent statue, his forehead pressed against the cool glass, his breath fogging a small circle on the pane. She could feel his quiet anxiety, a low-frequency hum that seemed to match the bus's vibration. She tried to smile at him, a gesture that felt brittle and foreign on her face, but his eyes remained fixed on the disappearing landscape, as if trying to memorize a life he was leaving forever. They were deposited at a desolate crossroads station, little more than a dusty patch of asphalt with a single, sun-bleached bench. The air here was starkly different. It was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of dry pine needles and cool, damp earth. A signpost, its letters faded and peeling, pointed toward a town named Bridger Creek. Shadow Ridge wasn't even listed. The station master, a man with a face like a wrinkled road map, informed them that the shuttle to the mountain communities only ran twice a day. The next one was in 4 hours. The wait was agonizing. The sun beat down, relentless and hot, and Ilara felt a bead of sweat trace a path down her spine. She used their precious, dwindling coins to buy Leo a bottle of water from a clanking vending machine. The sound was a stark, jarring reminder of their precarious situation. That fragile tendril of hope began to feel stretched thin, almost to the breaking point. The shuttle was not a bus, but a battered, rust-pocked van that groaned and wheezed as if in protest. The driver was a silent, grizzled man with eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He tossed their single suitcase in the back with a thud and didn't say a word as they climbed in. The van rattled up winding, narrow roads that clung to the mountainside. With every turn, the world outside became wilder, greener, and more imposing. Thick forests of pine and fir crowded the road, their dense canopies blocking out the sun and casting long, shifting shadows across the asphalt. The name Shadow Ridge suddenly felt less like a place and more like a warning. A nervous flutter began in Ilara's stomach, a frantic bird beating its wings against her ribs. Leo, exhausted from the journey, had finally fallen asleep, his head a heavy, warm weight on her shoulder. The intimate pressure was both a comfort and an immense, terrifying responsibility. "This is it." The driver's voice was a gravelly rasp, startling her out of her anxious thoughts. He jerked his thumb toward a narrow dirt track that disappeared into the dense woods. "End of the line. Your spot's 'bout a mile in. Can't take the van any further." He pulled over, the tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. He hauled their suitcase out and dropped it in the dust without another word. Before Ilara could even ask a question, he was back in the van, executing a tight turn and speeding back down the mountain. The sound of the straining engine faded quickly, swallowed by the trees until it was gone completely. An absolute, profound silence descended, deeper than any quiet she had ever known. It was broken only by the cold, mournful whisper of the wind through the high pine branches. A raw, primal sense of isolation washed over her, as vast and empty as the sky above. They were utterly alone. The walk felt like a pilgrimage to a forgotten, hostile land. The dirt path was a treacherous mess of gnarled roots and loose stones. Ilara dragged the heavy suitcase, its cardboard corners scraping against the ground, the rope handle digging painfully into her palm. Leo stumbled along beside her, his thin city sneakers providing no protection from the rough terrain. The forest was a suffocating, green and brown tunnel. The dense canopy of leaves overhead formed a thick roof, allowing only weak, dappled slivers of sunlight to reach the forest floor. Every sound was magnified in the oppressive quiet. The sudden snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot. The rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth sent a fresh wave of prickles across her skin. The smell was overwhelming, a rich, primal odor of wet soil, decaying leaves, and the musky scent of wildness. It was the smell of a place that was not meant for people. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of dread. After what felt like hours of struggling through the dense woods, the trees suddenly thinned, and they stumbled into a small, overgrown clearing. And there it was. Ilara's breath hitched in her throat, a strangled, painful sound. Her forward momentum stopped dead. The hope she had so carefully nurtured, the fragile image of a cozy little cabin she had built in her mind, shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't a house. It was a carcass. A skeleton of a building, picked clean by time and weather. The structure leaned at a perilous angle, as if a strong gust of wind would be enough to finish it off. A wave of vertigo washed over Ilara, and she swayed on her feet. This couldn't be it. It was a mistake. A cruel, cosmic joke. She felt Leo's hand tighten in hers, his fear a palpable current flowing into her. But she couldn't offer any comfort. She could only stare, her mind a screaming void of disbelief and horror. Her eyes, wide with shock, began to take in the details of the decay. A huge section of the roof had completely rotted through and collapsed inward, leaving a gaping black hole that stared up at the indifferent sky. The windows were empty sockets, the glass having shattered and fallen away decades ago, leaving jagged teeth of wood around the frames. The front porch hadn't just sagged, it had disintegrated into a pile of damp, moss-covered timber that was slowly being swallowed by the earth. A riot of thorny bushes and tall, aggressive weeds had consumed the yard, their tendrils crawling up the sides of the cabin like grasping fingers. The fragile flame of hope that had flickered inside her for the past few days was instantly, violently extinguished. It was replaced by an icy, crushing despair that felt heavier than any grief she had ever known. Her legs trembled, threatening to give out from under her. They had come all this way for nothing, for less than nothing. She forced her body to move, each step a monumental effort of will. Her feet felt like lead as she trudged through the knee-high weeds toward the mockery of a front door. It hung precariously from a single, rusted hinge, scraping against the warped floorboards as she pushed it open. The movement unleashed a foul wave of air from within, a putrid stench that hit her like a physical blow. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she gagged, her stomach churning violently. It was the thick, gag-inducing smell of years of dampness, of pervasive black mold, of rotting wood, and the sharp, musky odor of animal nests and droppings. It was the smell of death and decay. Beside her, Leo coughed, pulling the collar of his shirt up over his nose and mouth, his eyes watering. The hope had not just died, it had rotted, and this was its tomb. The beautiful mountain air outside was a distant memory, replaced by this suffocating, toxic poison. Her eyes slowly, painfully adjusted to the deep gloom inside. The interior was a scene of utter devastation, even worse than the exterior had promised. Rain, snow, and sun had poured through the caved-in roof for what must have been years, turning what little furniture remained into sodden, misshapen lumps of dark pulp. A thick, velvety layer of black mold crept up the walls in cancerous-looking patterns, a living, breathing disease that had consumed the cabin. As her eyes scanned the filthy floor, a fat, sleek rat scurried from one shadow to another, its tiny claws making a dry, scratching sound on the wood that echoed in the dead silence. The sound made her skin crawl, and a violent, uncontrollable shiver ran the length of her spine. This wasn't a shelter, it was a den, a place for vermin. A wave of nausea rose in her throat, hot and acidic. This was not a place for a child. This was not a place for anyone. Out of some desperate, ingrained habit, her hand fumbled along the wall for a light switch. Her fingertips met only the rough, splintered surface of a decaying plank. Of course, the utter foolishness of the gesture made her want to weep. Miles from any town, down a dirt track, there would be no power lines. Her gaze darted around the dark, damp room, searching for any sign of civilization, any modern convenience. In a far corner, she spotted the skeletal remains of an iron hand pump rising from the floorboards next to a rotted-out basin. A surge of desperate hope, absurd and irrational, made her rush over to it. She grabbed the cold, rusted handle and pumped it with all her might. The only response was a dry, rattling gasp from the pipe, followed by a small puff of dust and rust flakes that smelled of stale metal. No water, no power, no help. The totality of their isolation crashed down on her. She turned, her movements slow and robotic, to look at her son. Leo wasn't crying or complaining. His face was a pale, blank canvas of shock, his eyes wide with a quiet, bottomless horror that was far worse than tears. He looked impossibly small and fragile, a tiny figure completely dwarfed by the cavernous, rotting ruin around them. He was still clutching her hand, his small fingers digging into her palm with a strength that belied his size. He looked up at her, his lips trembling slightly. "Mom!" he whispered, and the single word was a universe of fear, confusion, and a child's plea for an explanation that didn't exist. Is this our new home?" The question, spoken in his small, wavering voice, was not an accusation. It was a genuine, terrified inquiry, and it pierced Ilara's heart with the clean, sharp force of a physical blade. She had no answer for him. She had nothing. Looking from Leo's terrified face to the decaying tomb around them, the last of Ilara's fortitude crumbled into dust. The grueling journey, the suffocating bus, the long, painful walk, it had all been a path leading them to this new, deeper circle of hell. She hadn't found a refuge. She had found a grave. She had traded the slow death of the city for the swift, brutal indifference of the wilderness. The universe wasn't just uncaring, it was actively cruel, dangling a thread of hope just to watch her climb it before cutting the line. She sank to her knees on the filthy, damp floorboards, the motion boneless and absolute. The single suitcase tipped over beside her, landing with a soft, dull thud that sounded like a shovelful of dirt hitting a coffin. It was the sound of finality. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, the grief, the fear, the anger, it all vanished, replaced by a vast, cold, and terrifying emptiness. She had finally hit the bottom. Days bled into a week of grim, back-breaking labor. The initial, crushing despair had receded, not replaced by hope, but by a cold, hard pragmatism. Ilara realized that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford. Leo was watching her, his young face a mirror of her own resolve. So she worked. From the moment the weak morning light filtered through the collapsed roof until the deep, unnerving darkness of the mountain night fell, she worked. They cleared a small corner of the main room, piling the sodden, pulpy remains of furniture outside. She used a flat piece of scrap metal to scrape the thickest layers of mold from the walls, her arms aching with the repetitive motion. The air remained thick with the stench of decay, but in their small, cleared patch of floor, there was the faintest scent of clean wood and their own sweat. It was the smell of a foothold, a tiny, defiant claim against the ruin. They were no longer just victims of this place. They were inhabitants, fighting for every inch. Their world shrank to the most basic of needs. Food was a constant, gnawing worry. Ilara had found a patch of wild blackberries growing near a creek a half-mile away, their tart sweetness a welcome explosion of flavor after a diet of the last of their crackers. Water was a grueling chore. The pump was dead, so twice a day she and Leo would make the trek to that same creek, filling their 2 plastic water bottles. The sound of the clear, cold water rushing over the stones was a sound of life in a world that felt dominated by death and silence. She taught Leo how to identify edible plants from a memory of a book she'd read long ago, a skill she never thought she'd need. At night, they huddled together for warmth under a single thin blanket, the vast, star-filled sky visible through the hole in the roof. The profound silence of the woods was no longer just menacing. It was a vast, empty canvas onto which her fears painted vivid, terrifying pictures. The focus of her efforts became the small, dark pantry adjoining the main room. It was barely a closet, but its roof was mostly intact, offering the best chance for a Drydock secure space. It was a filthy, claustrophobic hole filled with the debris of a long-abandoned life. Rotted sacks had split open, spilling what was once flour and sugar onto the floor, now a hardened, petrified mess. The smell was intense, a nauseating mix of mouse droppings, ancient spices, and the ubiquitous damp odor of rot. Ilara worked methodically, dragging out the hardened sacks, her hands raw and covered in filth. She found herself talking to herself in a low whisper, a stream of consciousness to keep the oppressive silence at bay. "Just this one corner," she'd mutter, her voice a dry rasp. "Just make this one corner clean." It was a mantra against the encroaching madness, a way to focus her mind on the task at hand and not the terrifying precariousness of their existence. Leo, eager to help, to be useful, squeezed into the back of the pantry where Ilara couldn't easily reach. He was quiet and diligent, his small hands pulling at bits of rotted cloth and splintered wood. There was a grim maturity in his movements, the fluid efficiency of a child who had learned too quickly that survival was a task, not a given. Ilara watched him for a moment, a painful lump forming in her throat. This was not the childhood she had envisioned for him. He should be playing with toys, not sorting through the detritus of a dead person's life in a collapsing cabin. A wave of guilt washed over her, so potent it made her feel dizzy. But then he looked up at her and gave a small, determined nod, and she saw not just a victim of circumstance, but a partner in their struggle. The thought gave her a sliver of strength. They were in this together, utterly and completely. He was the reason she could not, would not, give up. Suddenly, Leo's methodical work stopped. He let out a small, sharp gasp, a sound not of fear, but of pure surprise. "Mom," he whispered. his voice echoing slightly in the small, dark space. "Look." Ilara crawled over to him, her knees protesting on the rough floorboards. He was pointing at the floor. One of the wide, dark planks wasn't sitting flush with the others. It was slightly raised on one end. He placed his hand on it and rocked it. The board moved with a low, groaning complaint, a sound of wood that hadn't been disturbed in a very, very long time. A strange, cold prickle of unease ran down Ilara's spine. It was out of place. Everything else in this cabin was decaying into uniformity, a homogeneous state of ruin, but this board was different. It was a flaw in the pattern of decay, an anomaly. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a nervous flutter in her chest. She gently nudged Leo aside. "Let me see, sweetie." Her fingers, calloused and dirty, probed the edge of the board. It felt solid, not rotted like so many of the others. Using her fingernails, she pried at the edge. The wood resisted, then gave way with a splintering crack. She lifted the board up. It was heavy. The air that rose from the space beneath was different, not the foul stench of mold, but a dry, earthy smell of old, undisturbed wood and dust. The space beneath wasn't deep, just the hollow between the floor and the main support beam of the cabin's foundation. But there, on the dark, aged wood of the beam, was something that made the breath catch in her throat. It was a carving, small, no bigger than her palm, and executed with a simple, elegant precision that was jarringly out of place amidst the chaos and ruin. It was a stylized bird, its head cocked as if listening, its beak pointing away into the darkness of the main room. Ilara stared at the carving, a sense of profound strangeness washing over her. It wasn't crude graffiti. The lines were too clean, too deliberate. This was a mark made with purpose. Her fingers traced the outline of the bird, the wood smooth and cool beneath her touch. It felt ancient, like a secret sigil. Who would carve this here, hidden under the floor of a pantry? And why? The questions hung in the air, displacing the immediate, crushing weight of their survival needs. For the first time since their arrival, her mind was occupied by something other than hunger or fear. A new emotion, sharp and unfamiliar, pierced through the fog, curiosity. It was a dangerous, forgotten feeling. The carving was a loose thread in the fabric of this desolate place, and she felt an overwhelming, irrational compulsion to pull on it. A flicker of adrenaline, cold and sharp, coursed through her veins. This mark meant something. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was just a carpenter's mark, a doodle from a board builder decades ago. But the feeling in her gut, a deep, primal intuition she had learned to trust, told her otherwise. The bird wasn't just a carving. It was a signpost. Its beak pointed with an unmistakable intentionality. Following its direction with her eyes, her gaze was led out of the cramped, dark pantry, across the dusty, debris-strewn floor of the main room. Her eyes landed on the one feature of the cabin that was as imposing as the forest itself, the massive stone fireplace. It stood against the far wall like a pagan altar, a colossal structure of river rocks and crumbling, dark mortar. It was the heart of the cabin, and now, it seemed, the heart of this budding mystery. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down her spine. The bird was pointing directly at the hearth. Getting to her feet, she felt a strange new energy. The aches in her back and the gnawing hunger in her stomach seemed to fade into the background. She crossed the room, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. The fireplace loomed larger as she approached, a monument to a time when this place was a home, filled with warmth and light. Now, its gaping black mouth was just another shadow in a house full of them. The smell of old soot and damp stone was thick in the air, a cold, mineral scent. Why here? What could possibly be hidden in a solid wall of rock? She began her search at the base, running her hands over the cold, gritty surfaces of the stones. They were rough and varied in shape, fitted together in a rustic, sturdy mosaic. Her palms became coated in a fine layer of grey dust and soot. Leo stood a few feet behind her, a silent, watchful shadow, his eyes wide with the same nervous anticipation she felt churning in her stomach. Her fingers traced the lines of mortar, searching for any inconsistency, any sign of tampering. It seemed hopeless. The structure was a fortress, solid and immovable. She was about to give up, to dismiss the carving as a flight of fancy, when her hand brushed against a stone near the bottom right of the hearth. It felt different. While the other rocks were rough and porous, this one felt smoother, and the temperature was subtly, almost imperceptibly, cooler. She crouched down, her face just inches from the wall, peering at it in the dim light. Its color was off. While the surrounding stones were a mottled mix of dark grays and browns, this one was a more uniform, lighter shade of gray. It was as if it had been sheltered from the decades of smoke and grime that had stained everything else. It was the wrong stone. It didn't belong. The realization hit her like a jolt of electricity. Adrenaline surged through her. This was it. She could feel it. She tried to wiggle the stone with her bare hands, her fingers straining against the rough edges, but it was lodged tight. It wouldn't budge. She needed leverage. Her eyes scanned the debris around the hearth and found what she was looking for, a long, heavy iron poker, its handle wrapped in what was once leather. It was rusted and heavy, but solid. The cold, pitted metal felt like a weapon in her hand, a tool to unlock the secret. She took a deep breath, the dusty air catching in her throat, and jammed the pointed tip of the poker into the crumbling seam of mortar above the discolored stone. The grating sound of metal against rock was horrifically loud, echoing off the bare walls. For a moment, she froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, half expecting the entire chimney to collapse upon them, but the structure held. Summoning her strength, she put her full weight on the handle of the poker, using it as a lever. The muscles in her arms and back screamed in protest. The poker groaned, the old metal bending slightly under the strain. For a moment, nothing happened. The stone was unmovable. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, began to creep in. It was all for nothing. Then, just as she was about to give up, she heard it. A faint, sharp crack. Not loud, but definitive. The sound of a seal breaking. A spiderweb of tiny fractures appeared in the mortar around the poker's tip. Renewed hope surged through her. "It's moving," she whispered, as much to herself as to Leo. She repositioned the poker and heaved again, this time with a desperate, guttural cry of effort. The mortar crumbled, raining down in a small cloud of grey dust, and the stone shifted, sliding inward by a half-inch. A triumphant, breathless laugh escaped her lips. She dropped the poker with a loud clatter and scrambled forward, jamming her raw, trembling fingers into the gap she had created. The edge of the stone was sharp and cold. She pulled, it resisted, scraping against the rocks around it, then slowly, grudgingly, it came free. She fell backward. The heavy stone clutched in her hands. It left a perfect, dark, rectangular hole in the fireplace, a void in the solid wall. It was a secret cavity, a hidden chamber. Leo gasped, pointing a shaking finger into the opening. Ilara's own eyes were fixed on the darkness within. It was a tomb-like blackness, smelling of enclosed space and dry, ancient dust. The mystery of the bird had led them here, to a hole in a wall. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her temples, a frantic, pulsing rhythm that drowned out all other sound. She peered into the darkness, her eyes struggling to adjust, and then she saw it. Tucked deep inside the cavity, shielded from the damp and decay that had consumed the rest of the cabin, sat a metal box. It was a simple, grey strongbox, about the size of a shoebox. Unlike everything else in this ruin, it was clean. There was no rust, no mold, no sign of water damage. It had been placed here to be preserved, to wait. A powerful sense of destiny, of unearthing something that was meant to be found, washed over her. This wasn't an accident. The crumbling cabin, the long-lost aunt, the carved bird. It was all a sequence, a path laid out for her to follow. She reached into the cold, dark hole, her arm disappearing up to the elbow. Her fingers brushed against the box. The metal was shockingly cold, a smooth, solid reality in a world of rot and illusion. With her heart lodged firmly in her throat, she drew the box out into the weak light. It was heavier than she expected. It had a simple, tarnished brass latch on the front. Leo crouched beside her, his small body vibrating with a mixture of fear and awe. He reached out a tentative finger and touched the lid, then snatched it back as if burned. The air in the room felt thick, charged with unspoken questions. What treasures or horrors had this box protected for all these years? Gold, money, something else entirely. Ilara's mind raced. For a moment, she was afraid to open it, terrified that the contents would be more devastating than the ruin surrounding them. But she knew she had no choice. She had come this far. She had to know. She rested her trembling thumbs on the latch, took one last, shaky breath, and flicked it open. The latch made a soft, metallic click, a tiny sound that seemed to shatter the immense silence of the cabin. She lifted the heavy lid. A faint, dry scent rose from within, the smell of old paper and leather and time itself. There was no gold, no jewels. The first thing she saw was a small, handsome photo album bound in dark brown leather. The cover was unmarked. With fingers that felt clumsy and numb, she lifted it out. It was surprisingly heavy. She placed the box aside and settled the album on her lap. Leo leaned in, his chin resting on her shoulder, his warm breath on her neck. For a long moment, she just stared at the cover, her mind a complete blank. This felt sacred, a violation of someone's private history. But the feeling that this history was somehow connected to her, that it was her history, was an undeniable, terrifying certainty that had taken root in her soul. She opened the cover. The first page was a single photograph, protected by a thin sheet of transparent paper. The photograph was of a young girl. She was perhaps 12 years old, with long dark hair and a gap-toothed smile that radiated a pure, unadulterated joy. She was standing proudly in front of the cabin. But it was not the broken skeleton that Ilara knew. In the picture, the cabin was beautiful. It was well kept, with bright white paint on the window frames and a porch swing where a pile of rotted wood now lay. There were vibrant red flowers spilling out of window boxes. The girl in the photo was leaning against the porch railing, one hand shading her eyes from a sun that seemed impossibly bright. And then, the world stopped turning. Ilara felt the air leave her lungs in a silent rush. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. She knew that smile. She knew those eyes. She saw them every single day in the reflection of a dirty mirror or a puddle of creek water. The girl was her. A violent wave of vertigo and nausea washed over her. She slammed the album shut, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. "No," she whispered, the word a dry, rasping sound. "No, it's not possible." She had never been to this place. Her childhood was a tapestry of memories woven in a cramped city apartment, of concrete playgrounds and the distant scream of sirens. Her parents, her kind, gentle parents who had raised her, who had both died of illness within years of each other, had never mentioned a cabin, a mountain, a place called Shadow Ridge. This was a mistake, a trick of the light, a girl who just looked like her. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely control them, she forced herself to open the album again. She turned the page. The next photo showed the same girl, this time sitting on the grass, weaving a crown of wildflowers. Her face was turned to the camera, captured in a moment of laughter. It was her laugh. She knew it instinctively. Her rational mind screamed that it was impossible, but her heart knew it was the truth. Page after page, it was the same girl. Her face growing slightly older, her smile a little less gap-toothed. But it was always undeniably her as a child, in a life she had no memory of, a phantom life. It felt like watching a film about a stranger who had stolen her face. She felt a terrifying sense of dislocation, as if her own identity was a fragile garment that was being ripped away from her. Who was she? Was the life she remembered a lie? The thought was so monstrous, so destabilizing, that her mind refused to fully grasp it. A low, keening sound started in her throat, a sound of pure, bewildered grief for a self she didn't even know she had lost. Leo looked up at her, his face pale with confusion and fear at her reaction. "Mom, who is that?" he asked, his voice a small, trembling whisper. With a deep, shuddering breath, Ilara forced herself to continue. Her movements were robotic. She had to see it all. She had to know. At the very back of the album, tucked into a leather sleeve behind the last photograph, were two folded pieces of paper. They were yellowed and brittle with age, the creases sharp and permanent. The smell of dry, acidic paper was strong. She carefully extracted the first document, her fingers fumbling. The paper was so fragile she was afraid it would turn to dust in her hands. She unfolded it under the weak light filtering in from the doorway. It was a birth certificate. The formal, typed letters were faded but still legible, and the name printed at the top made a fresh wave of nausea roll through her. The name was not Ilara, it was Sophia. Sophia Annabel Serrano. She scanned the rest of the document, her eyes darting from box to box until they landed on the date of birth. Her heart stopped. It was her birthday. Not just the same month, or the same year. It was the exact date. Day, month, and year. The world began to tilt violently, the floorboards seeming to shift beneath her. A high-pitched ringing started in her ears. Ilara and Sophia, two names, one birthday, one face. It didn't make sense. It was a paradox, a tear in the fabric of reality. She felt a desperate, clawing need for the people who had raised her, for the woman she had called her mother. She wanted to ask them what this meant, to have them explain this impossibility away, but they were gone. They had taken their secrets, whatever they were, to the grave. She was alone with this shattering new truth, a truth that suggested her entire life, her very name, was a carefully constructed lie. The birth certificate trembled in her hand, no longer a document, but an indictment. Her gaze fell upon the second piece of paper, still folded, still waiting. Her hand moved toward it with a dreadful slowness, as if it were a venomous snake. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this second document held the answer that would destroy the last remnants of the world she knew. She picked it up. It was a newspaper clipping, cut neatly from a paper called the Ridgeline Chronicle. The dateline at the top was from 30 years ago. The headline was printed in bold, stark letters that seemed to shout at her from across the decades. Local journalists perish in fiery mountain crash. Her eyes devoured the text below, a story of a horrific accident on a winding mountain road not far from here. A car that had lost control plunged into a ravine and burst into flames. The victims were a husband and wife, renowned investigative journalists. Their names were Marcus and Lena Serrano. Serrano, the same last name as the girl on the birth certificate. Sophia Serrano. Ilara's breath hitched, a painful, tearing sensation in her chest. She forced her eyes to the final paragraph of the article. It was short, just 2 sentences, but those sentences were the final, devastating blow. The words blurred through the hot tears that suddenly filled her eyes. The article stated that the Serranos' 12-year-old daughter, Sophia, who was believed to have been in the car with them, was missing from the scene. Her body was never recovered from the burnt-out wreckage. Authorities presumed she had been thrown from the vehicle during the crash and had either perished in the wilderness or been consumed by the fire. Sophia was vanished, presumed dead. Ilara looked from the newspaper clipping to the photo of the smiling girl, then to her own trembling hands. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening final sound of a coffin lid closing. I am Sophia. I am the girl who died. The flimsy newspaper clipping felt impossibly heavy in Ilara's hand, a paper-thin anchor dragging her down into a freezing, dark reality. Sophia. She was Sophia. The name echoed in the screaming void of her mind, a ghost word that belonged to a ghost girl. Her entire life, the 42 years she had meticulously catalogued in her memory, was a fabrication, a lie. The people who had raised her, the kind, gentle couple she had loved and mourned as her parents, were her aunt and uncle. Their soft voices and warm hugs were not the foundation of her life, but the walls of a carefully constructed prison designed to protect her from a truth they thought would destroy her. A raw, guttural sob ripped from her throat, a sound of such profound loss it felt like it was tearing her soul in two. She was mourning a life she had never even known she'd lived, and simultaneously mourning the lie that had been her only comfort. The dusty air of the cabin felt thin, unbreathable, and she gasped for air that wouldn't come. She was not Ilara, she was a memory. The pieces began to click into place, each one a shard of glass pressing into her heart. Her great-aunt, the distant, almost mythical figure from her fabricated childhood, was not just a relative, she was a rescuer, a conspirator. She had pulled a traumatized, amnesiac 12-year-old girl from the wreckage of her life, from the inferno that consumed her real parents. She had given her a new name, a new history, and hidden her away in the anonymity of the city. The amnesia, which doctors had once attributed to a childhood fever, was a lie. It was trauma. A merciful blank slate wiped clean by a horror too great for a child's mind to hold. This cabin wasn't just a worthless inheritance, it was a map. A breadcrumb trail left across 3 decades, leading her back to the scene of the crime, back to the origin of her own erasure. She felt a chill spread through her limbs, a coldness that had nothing to do with the damp mountain air. It was the cold of a tomb that had just been opened, and she was the body inside. Her trembling fingers traced the names in the newspaper article, Marcus and Lena Serrano, her parents. The words felt foreign on her tongue, impossible to form. Investigative journalists. The article was vague, but the implication was clear. They had uncovered something dangerous enough to get them killed in a way that could be dismissed as a tragic accident, and that something was connected to this land, this mountain. The illegal land-grabbing scheme mentioned in the premise became a monstrous, shadowy entity in her mind. Her parents hadn't just died. They had been silenced, executed. The fiery crash was not an accident. It was an assassination. The realization landed with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind from her lungs. This wasn't just her personal history. It was the history of a crime, a vast injustice that had been buried for 30 years under a thin layer of soil and lies. And the key, the proof, had been waiting here, in this box, in her hands. The weight of it was immense. Leo, seeing the terror etched onto his mother's face, moved closer, his small hand resting on her arm. "Mom, what is it? You're scaring me." His voice, small and trembling, sliced through the fog of her horror. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just her son, but the grandson of Marcus and Lena Serrano. He had their blood in his veins. He was the next link in a chain that someone had tried violently to break. The abstract danger of a 30-year-old crime suddenly became terrifyingly immediate. This wasn't just about a forgotten past. It was about their future. A new, fierce wave of emotion surged through her, displacing the grief and confusion. It was anger, a white-hot, righteous fury on behalf of the parents she couldn't remember and the life that had been stolen from her. This cabin was their legacy. This land was their legacy. And she would not let the people who murdered them take it from her. The thought solidified into a hard, cold resolve in the pit of her stomach. They would not be erased. The sudden, alien sound ripped through the profound silence of the woods. It wasn't the whisper of wind or the snap of a twig. It was the low, guttural rumble of a powerful engine, a sound of wealth and force that did not belong here. It grew steadily louder, a mechanical growl climbing the dirt track that led to the cabin. Ilara's blood ran cold. Instinct took over. She shoved the newspaper clipping and the birth certificate back into the metal box, snapped the lid shut, and slid it deep into the dark cavity of the fireplace. Her hands moved with a frantic, desperate speed. She grabbed the loose stone and jammed it back into place, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sound of the engine was closer now, right outside. A heavy vehicle crunched to a stop in the clearing, followed by the solid, definitive thud of a truck door slamming shut. It was a sound of arrival, a sound of purpose, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it was not a friendly visit. She grabbed Leo, pulling him behind her. Through the empty frame of the doorway, she saw him. He was a man who seemed to defy the rustic decay of his surroundings. Tall and broad-shouldered, he was dressed in crisp khaki trousers and a starched white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal thick, tanned forearms. His hair was a distinguished shock of silver, perfectly coiffed. He moved with an easy, predatory grace, his expensive leather boots making a soft, crunching sound on the overgrown path. The scent of his cologne, a sharp citrus and spice aroma, wafted into the cabin, an invasive smell of civilization and power that felt like a violation. In one hand, he carried a polished walking stick, which he used not for support, but to point and gesture. as if appraising his domain. He stopped just outside the doorway, his shadow falling long and dark across the rotted floorboards. His face was a mask of pleasant, paternal concern, but his eyes, small and dark, held a cold, reptilian stillness. They missed nothing. "Hello there," he boomed, his voice a smooth, deep baritone that was accustomed to being obeyed. It was a voice of practiced charm, but it held an undercurrent of solid steel. "I do apologize for intruding. My name is Alarico Bastos. Most folks around here just call me Doctor." He smiled, a wide, confident display of perfectly white teeth. The name hit Ilara like a physical blow. Bastos. It wasn't in the newspaper article, but she felt a jolt of recognition, a primal sense of danger that tightened the muscles in her back. This was him, the patriarch, the man who owned the region, the man from the story. She was just beginning to understand. "I own most of the land bordering this old parcel," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the surrounding forest with his stick. "I heard someone had finally moved into the old Serrano place. I must say, I am surprised. I thought this cabin was beyond saving." His eyes swept over the ruin with a look of theatrical pity, but there was a flicker of something else in their depths, a sharp, calculating assessment. He took a step closer, his gaze landing on Leo, who was still hiding behind Ilara's legs. The smile on Alarico's face softened, becoming avuncular, but it didn't reach his cold, dark eyes. "And you have a son. The mountains are no place for a child, my dear lady, especially not in a state like this." His words were like silk, but they were wrapping around her, suffocating her. Each sentence was a subtle dismissal, a way of establishing her weakness and his power. She felt a tremor run through her, but she forced herself to stand her ground, her hand resting protectively on Leo's shoulder. She felt the need to say something, to assert her right to be there. But her throat was tight with fear, the words trapped behind a wall of pure adrenaline. Alarico seemed to sense her fear, and his smile widened, a predator sensing weakness. He was enjoying this, the slow, methodical process of intimidation. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken menace that was far more terrifying than any open threat could ever be. "I see you've been cleaning." He gestured with his stick toward the small, cleared corner of the room. The comment was dismissive, as if noting the futile efforts of an insect. A valiant effort, but this place, it has bad memories. A tragedy happened here a long time ago. The whole family, gone. He clicked his tongue in mock sympathy, his eyes fixed on Ilara's face, searching for a reaction. She felt her blood turn to ice. He was testing her, taunting her. He knew who she was, or, at the very least, he suspected. She forced her expression to remain a blank mask, a feat of willpower that took every ounce of her strength. She could not let him see that she knew. Not yet. Alarico let the silence hang in the air for a moment before continuing, his voice dropping to a confidential, conspiratorial tone. "Look, I'll be blunt. This property is worthless. It's a liability, an eyesore, but I like to keep my lands tidy." He leaned forward slightly, his cologne suddenly overpowering, making her feel nauseous. "I am prepared to make you an offer," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "to take this burden off your hands. $20,000. Cash." The number was an insult. Even in this state of ruin, the land itself, acres of untouched mountain forest, had to be worth a fortune. It was a predator's offer, a lowball designed to prey on her desperation. He expected her to be grateful, to leap at the chance to escape this hovel. He saw her as a destitute widow, a weakling to be manipulated. He had no idea he was talking to a ghost. He had no idea he was standing in front of the daughter of the people he had murdered. The irony was so bitter, so profound, that a hysterical laugh almost bubbled up from her chest. She choked it down, the effort making her eyes water. She stared back at him, her silence her only weapon. The small, hard knot of fury in her stomach gave her the strength not to crumble, not to betray the storm of emotions raging inside her. She would not give him the satisfaction. Her silence seemed to unnerve him. A flicker of irritation crossed his smooth features, a crack in the paternal facade. "It's a generous offer," he said, his voice a little harder now. "More than you'd get from anyone else. Think about your boy. You could take that money, go back to the city." Start fresh. The phrase, start fresh, was laced with a chilling irony that made her skin crawl. He was the reason she needed to start fresh in the first place. He had destroyed her life not once, but twice. The certainty of it hit her with the force of a physical revelation. Daniel's death. The suspicious construction accident. It was all too convenient. A way to push her to the brink, to make her desperate enough to sell her past for a pittance. He had been watching her, waiting. The web of his influence was far larger and more terrifying than she could have ever imagined. The world tilted on its axis as she realized this monster hadn't just appeared. He had been a shadow looming over her entire life. He must have seen the flicker of understanding, the dawning horror in her eyes. His own eyes narrowed, the last pretense of charm falling away to reveal the cold, hard predator beneath. He took a small step back, his hand tightening on his polished walking stick. "You should think about it carefully," he said, his voice now a low, menacing purr. "The mountains can be a treacherous place, unforgiving. Things happen up here." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He let his gaze drift from her to Leo, and the implied threat was as clear as if he had screamed it. The air crackled with tension. Ilara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her fury was a shield. She met his gaze, her own eyes burning with a hatred so pure it felt like it could set the very air between them on fire. She would not look away. She would not let him see her break. He had underestimated her. He had mistaken a ghost for a victim, and he was about to discover the difference. Then came the final, devastating blow. Alarico smiled, a slow, cruel curving of his lips. "It's all about safety, you see," he murmured, his voice a venomous whisper. "Building things properly, using the right materials. I hear your late husband worked in construction. Such a tragedy. Scaffolding collapses. It's a terrible, terrible thing when contractors cut corners. Accidents happen." The words hit her with the force of a confession. He knew. He had done it. He had murdered Daniel. He had orchestrated the accident that had sent her spiraling into poverty and despair, driving her right into this trap. The connection was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty, delivered with a smug, chilling precision. The ground seemed to drop away from beneath her feet. This man hadn't just killed her parents 30 years ago. He had reached across time and space to destroy her new life, to take her husband, to orphan her son all over again. He was not just a villain from the past. He was the architect of her entire life's suffering. Alarico held her gaze for one more chilling moment, his smile widening as he saw the pure, undiluted horror on her face. He had delivered his message. He had asserted his total, terrifying power. With a small, satisfied nod, he turned his back on her. "You have 2 days to consider my offer," he called over his shoulder, his voice once again booming with false bonhomie. "I'll be in touch." He walked away without a backward glance, the sound of his boots crunching on the path, a steady, rhythmic beat of doom. The truck door opened and slammed shut. The powerful engine roared to life, the sound tearing through the quiet woods like a scream. The vehicle executed a sharp turn and sped away, its rumble slowly fading back down the mountain until it was gone, swallowed by the trees. He left behind a silence that was 1,000 times more terrifying than the noise, a silence filled with the ghost of his words and the suffocating weight of his threat. She stood frozen in the doorway, her body trembling uncontrollably, her arms wrapped around a terrified, silent Leo. The last vestiges of sunlight were dying, and long, cold shadows stretched from the trees, grasping at the cabin like skeletal fingers. The enemy was no longer a ghost from a yellowed newspaper clipping. He had a face, a voice, and a name. And he had just declared war. He had threatened her son. He thought he had her cornered, a desperate animal with no way out, but he was wrong. He had not cornered an animal, he had cornered a mother. And in the secret cavity of the fireplace, she had the one thing he feared most, the truth. But what could she do? Run and let him win forever, or stay? And fight a monster who had already proven he could kill anyone who got in his way? What would you do in her place? Would you protect your child by disappearing, or would you risk everything you have left for the chance at justice? The terror that Alarico left behind was a physical entity, a cold, oily film that clung to everything in the ruined cabin. Ilara's body trembled. Not from the mountain chill, but from a rage so profound it threatened to consume her. He had admitted it. He had dangled the murder of her husband in front of her like a trophy, a casual testament to his limitless power. She sank to the dusty floor, pulling Leo tight against her chest, inhaling the familiar scent of his hair, a mix of wood smoke and boyish sweat. It was an anchor in the storm of her horror. This monster, this Dr. Bastos, was not just a villain from the past. He was a cancer that had metastasized through her entire life. From the parents she never knew to the husband she had just lost. A low, guttural sound escaped her throat. The growl of a cornered animal that has finally decided to bite back. He thought he was hunting a desperate widow. He was about to find out he was hunting a ghost, and she was done being silent. Her mind, sharpened by adrenaline, began to work with a desperate clarity. Going to the police in Shadow Ridge was a death sentence. Alarico's roots in this mountain were deep and rotten. The law here would be just another one of his tools. She was utterly alone. Or was she? A name, half forgotten from the lawyer's documents, surfaced in her mind. Silas Blackwood. The deed had listed him as the owner of the small plot bordering her own, a piece of land Alarico hadn't managed to swallow. He was a hermit, the station master had said, a relic. If he had been here for 30 years, he would have known the Serranos. He would have been a neighbor. He would have seen something. The hope was a fragile, dangerous thing, a tiny flame in a hurricane. Was he a potential ally? A guardian of the truth? Or was he another one of Bastos's terrified subjects, his silence bought with fear? It was a gamble, but she had nothing left to lose. He was her only move on a chessboard where the king was already in check. She waited until the moon climbed high above the skeletal trees, casting the clearing in a stark, bone-white light. Leo was asleep, his face a mask of peaceful innocence that she felt a desperate need to protect. "I will be back," she whispered, her breath fogging in the cold air. The promise felt like a prayer. Leaving him, even for a short time, felt like tearing off a limb, but this was a path she had to walk alone. She took only one thing from the secret cavity, the small, leather-bound photo album. It was her key, her proof, the only bridge to the identity that had been stolen from her. She slipped out of the cabin, the oppressive silence of the ruin at her back. The forest at night was a different world. The rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth and the mournful hoot of a distant owl were a comfort compared to the chilling silence left by Alarico. The cold air felt clean, washing away the foul taint of his presence. She was not a victim anymore. She was a hunter, and she was following a scent that was 30 years old. The crude map from the deed was her only guide. She examined it under the feeble, dying beam of a small flashlight she'd found, its light casting frantic, dancing shadows. Her property was a small island in a vast sea belonging to Bastos, but to the north, a single small square was marked Blackwood. The creek, their lifeline for water, formed the boundary. It would lead her there. She moved through the woods, following the faint, gurgling music of the water. The journey was a painful baptism. Thorny branches clawed at her skin and clothes, leaving stinging red lines on her arms. Gnarled roots seemed to reach up from the dark earth to trip her. She fell more than once, the sharp shock of pain a brutal reminder of her vulnerability, but with each scrape and stumble, her resolve hardened. This pain was real. It was honest. It was the price of movement, the cost of fighting back. The sound of the creek grew louder, a silver thread of sound guiding her through the suffocating darkness of the forest. After what felt like an eternity, a new light appeared through the dense web of trees. It was not the cold, indifferent light of the moon, but a warm, flickering amber glow, the light of a kerosene lamp. As she drew closer, a new scent cut through the damp air, wood smoke. It was the smell of a hearth, of a home. In a small, neat clearing stood a cabin. It was small and weathered, but it stood straight and proud, its stone chimney breathing a steady plume of grey smoke into the night sky. The windows glowed. A fierce, desperate longing welled up inside her, to run to that light, to that warmth, to safety. But the hunted animal in her took over. She melted back into the shadows of the trees, her heart hammering against her ribs. The photo album felt like a lead weight in her hand. This was it. The door to that cabin could lead to salvation or to a second, final grave. Her future, and Leo's, would be decided by the man who lived behind that warm, dew-inviting light. She forced her legs to move, stepping out of the tree line and into the moonlit clearing. The sudden exposure made her skin crawl, and she felt 1,000 unseen eyes on her. She walked up the 3 solid wooden steps of the porch and hesitated. The wood was clean, swept free of debris. A stack of neatly chopped firewood was piled against the wall. This was the home of a man who cared. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she raised a hand that trembled violently and knocked. The sound was a pathetic, soft tapping, almost lost to the whisper of the wind. She knocked again, harder this time, the sharp raps echoing in the profound silence. For a long moment, there was no response. Disappointment, cold and bitter, began to seep into her bones. Maybe he wasn't home. Maybe he wouldn't answer. Then she heard a sound from within. The slow, deliberate scrape of a chair on a wooden floor, followed by the heavy tread of footsteps. The door didn't open. Instead, a voice, rough and dry as sandpaper, spoke through the thick wood. "Who is it? What do you want?" The voice was filled with a deep, ingrained suspicion, the sound of a man who had not welcomed a visitor in a very long time. Ilara's throat was tight and dry, her own voice a stranger to her ears when she finally managed to speak. "My name is Ilara," she said, trying to keep the tremor out of her words. I'm your new neighbor, from the old Serrano place." The name hung in the air between them, a charged and dangerous thing. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the questions. She could feel him on the other side of the door, listening, judging. She could almost hear the frantic turning of gears in a mind that had been locked away for decades. Finally, after a lifetime of waiting, she heard the unmistakable, heavy sound of a metal bolt being drawn back. The door creaked open just a few inches, held fast by a thick chain. A sliver of a face appeared in the gap. An old man, his face a deeply lined roadmap of sorrow and fear, a pair of pale, watery eyes, wide with a hunted look, peered out at her. His hair was thin and white, his skin papery. He looked like a ghost himself, haunted by the very mountain that served as his fortress. "The Serrano place is cursed," he rasped, his voice a low, fearful whisper. "No one should be there. You need to leave. You and the boy. You need to run." His words were not a warning, they were a plea, born of a terror so old it had become a part of him. He started to close the door, to shut her out, to retreat back into the safety of his self-imposed prison. "Wait," Ilara cried, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, I know who lived there. I know who I am." The old man froze, his hand faltering on the door. His pale eyes widened, and a flicker of something she couldn't name, recognition, horror, disbelief, passed across his face. "I am Sophia." She said the name out loud for the first time to another person, and the word felt both alien and profoundly true. "I am Sophia Serrano." To prove it, she held up the photo album, her hands shaking so badly she could barely keep it steady. She opened it to the first page, to the picture of the smiling, gap-toothed girl standing in front of the beautiful, well-kept cabin. She pressed the album against the door, pushing it into the narrow gap. "Now look," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please, just look." The old man flinched as if the photograph were a weapon. He stared at it, his eyes darting from the image of the girl to Ilara's face, then back again. A low, choked sound escaped his lips, a sound of agony, of a wound being torn open after 30 years. The chain rattled as his hand trembled. Slowly, with the deliberate movement of a man in a trance, he unlatched the chain and pulled the door open, revealing his full, frail form. His name was Silas. He stumbled back as if she had struck him, his face ashen in the flickering lamplight. "Sophia," he whispered. "The name a fragile, broken thing. It can't be. You died. We all thought you died." Tears began to stream down his wrinkled cheeks. Carving clean paths through the dust and grime of decades, he looked at her not as a stranger, but as an apparition, a ghost from a past he had tried and failed to bury. He confirmed everything. He had been their groundskeeper, their friend. He loved Marcus and Lena Serrano like family. He had watched Sophia grow up, a bright, fierce girl who loved the mountain. He collapsed into a wooden chair by the fire, his body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. He had lived for 30 years with the crushing guilt of his own survival, haunted by the memory of the fire, the screams, and the terrible, suffocating silence that followed. His grief was so raw, so palpable, that it filled the small cabin, a living, breathing entity. When the storm of his weeping subsided, he began to talk, the words pouring out of him in a torrent, a confession held back for 3 decades. His voice was a low, pained rasp. "That night," he began, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. "It wasn't a car crash, it was an execution. Alarico's men. They came for your father's work." He explained that her parents were about to publish a massive exposé, a detailed account of Alarico Bastos' empire, built on decades of fraud, blackmail, and murder. They had amassed a mountain of evidence, enough to put him away for life. They had uncovered original land deeds he had stolen, ledgers detailing his extortion rackets, and witness testimonies he had suppressed through violence. Alarico couldn't let that story come out, Silas choked, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I was supposed to be watching the house. I saw the cars coming up the road. I was a coward. I hid. I listened to the screams. I smelled the gasoline." His confession was a physical blow, each word a hammer strike against the fragile walls of Ilara's composure. "They set the car on fire with your parents inside," he whispered, the words barely audible. "They made it look like an accident. But your great-aunt, she got there first. She must have had a feeling. She pulled you from the house just before they arrived, hid you in the woods. They never knew you weren't in the car. She saved your life, Sophia." The story explained the gaps, the amnesia, the new identity. It was a desperate act of love and protection, but Silas wasn't finished. The worst of his guilt, the secret he had guarded for 30 years, was still to come. He looked at her then, his eyes pleading for an absolution she could not give. "The photos, the birth certificate. That's not the real proof," he said, his voice trembling. "That's just the key. Your father was smart. He knew Alarico might come for him. He made a copy of everything." A new, electric tension filled the small cabin. Ilara leaned forward, her entire being focused on his next words. "He told me, if anything ever happened, where the real evidence was hidden," Silas continued, his voice gaining a sliver of strength, of purpose. "He knew Alarico would tear the house apart. He would search everywhere. So Marcus put it somewhere Alarico would never think to look, somewhere protected from fire and time." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "He put it in the well, the old stone well behind the cabin. He sealed everything, the original ledgers, the stolen deeds, your mother's notes, in a waterproof metal box. He weighted it down and dropped it to the bottom. He said the water would keep it safe. He said one day, the truth would need to be drawn up from the darkness." The room fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of Ilara's own heart. The final piece of the puzzle had just been slammed into place. Silas grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong for a man so frail. His eyes burned with a desperate, feverish light. "You have to get it, Sophia. Tonight. Now. Alarico's offer. His threat. He knows someone is here. He's getting nervous. He won't wait long. He'll send his men. He might even destroy the place, burn it to the ground just to be sure." The old man's fear was a contagion, spreading to Ilara, chilling her blood. He was right. Her presence had disturbed the sleeping dragon, and its fiery breath was imminent. The 2 days Alarico had given her were not a courtesy, they were a countdown. There was no time to think, no time to plan. There was only time for action. She had to get back to the cabin, back to Leo, and back to that well. The entire weight of her parents' legacy, of the justice they died for, rested at the bottom of a dark, cold hole in the ground, and she was the only one who could pull it into the light. She ran. She didn't thank Silas, didn't say goodbye. There were no words. She fled from the warmth of his cabin back into the cold, hostile embrace of the forest. Her feet, clumsy and slow on the way there, were now winged with purpose. She flew over the treacherous roots and rocks, her body fueled by a pure, potent cocktail of terror and hope. The photo album was forgotten, left behind on Silas's table. She needed only one thing now. Her mind was a singular, focused point of light in the darkness. The well, the well. The well. The trees seemed to blur past her. Dark, silent sentinels watching her frantic flight. The sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of her heart were a drumbeat, counting down the precious seconds. She burst through the tree line and into the clearing, where her own ruined cabin stood, a dark, silent hulk under the moonlight. It looked exactly as she had left it. For a brief, terrifying moment, she allowed herself to hope that she had time. She crept inside, her movements now silent and deliberate. Leo was still asleep, his breathing soft and even. The sight of him, so peaceful and unaware, was a sharp, painful pang in her chest. She knelt beside him and gently brushed the hair from his forehead, her touch as light as a moth's wing. A fierce, protective love, so powerful it was almost physically painful, washed over her. She was doing this for him, for the future he deserved, free from the shadows that had haunted their family for generations. She stood up, her resolve hardening into steel. She found an old, frayed rope in the debris pile, its fibers thick with dust, but still strong. She also grabbed the rusted iron poker from the hearth. It felt heavy and cold in her hand, no longer a tool of discovery, but a weapon. Armed, she stepped back outside into the cold, silent night and walked towards the back of the cabin, towards the old stone well. It was almost completely hidden, choked by a thicket of thorny bushes and vines. It looked ancient, a circular stone structure barely rising 3 feet from the ground. A rotted wooden cover lay in splintered pieces beside it, having disintegrated years ago. The darkness inside the well was absolute, a perfect black circle that seemed to swallow the moonlight. The air rising from it was cold and carried a damp, earthy smell, the scent of deep, undisturbed places. A primitive, childlike fear prickled at the back of her neck. Wells were for wishes or for drowning. Tonight, this one was for resurrection. She secured her flashlight to the lip of the well, its weak beam cutting a pathetic cone into the blackness, illuminating only the slick, moss-covered stones of the first few feet. It revealed nothing of the depths. She tied one end of the rope around the handle of the iron poker, fashioning a crude grappling hook. Taking a deep breath, she lowered it into the void. The rope played out, seeming to go on forever. 10 feet, 20, 30. The silence was deafening as the poker descended into the darkness. She listened for the splash of it hitting the water, her ears straining. Finally, she heard it. Not a loud splash, but a soft, deep plop, followed by the faintest ripple of an echo. The water was low. Her heart hammered. What if Silas was wrong? What if the box was gone, or had never been there at all? She began to drag the poker across the bottom, the rope sawing against the stone lip of the well. The metal hook scraped against the rocky bottom with a grating sound that set her teeth on edge. It felt hopeless, like fishing for a needle in a vast dark ocean. She was about to give up, to pull the rope up in defeat, when she felt it. A solid, metallic clink, not the dull thud of rock, but the sharp, clear sound of metal hitting metal. The hook had caught on something. She pulled gently on the rope. There was resistance. Something heavy was on the other end. "Please," she whispered to the darkness. "Please, please, be there." She began to haul the rope up, hand over hand. It was incredibly heavy, far heavier than the poker alone. Her muscles screamed, her back straining with the effort. The wet rope was slick and cold, slipping through her raw fingers. Slowly, painstakingly, she drew her prize up from the depths. A dark shape emerged from the black water, breaking the surface and rising into the weak beam of the flashlight. It was a box, a heavy metal box, dark and streaked with slime, but solid, intact. Water streamed from its sides as it rose, a final offering to the well that had been its tomb for 30 years. With a final, guttural cry of effort, she heaved it up and over the stone lip. It landed on the damp earth with a heavy, solid thud, the sound of victory. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely work the simple latches. They were stiff with age and disuse, but they were not rusted shut. Her father had planned well. With a final, painful click, the latches sprang open. She lifted the heavy lid. The contents were wrapped in oilcloth. She peeled back the damp, black fabric. Her breath held tight in her chest, and there they were. Ledgers, thick, leather-bound books filled with neat columns of numbers and names, bundles of paper, tied with string, the original deeds, her mother's notes, sworn affidavits from people long dead or silenced. It was all there. A comprehensive account of Alarico's reign of terror. It was a bomb, a weapon powerful enough to bring down an empire. A wave of triumphant, dizzying relief washed over her. She had done it. She had the proof. Her father's voice seemed to whisper to her on the wind, a ghostly sigh of vindication, and in that exact moment of triumph, her world caught fire. A sudden, brilliant flash of light cut through the darkness, followed by the low, guttural rumble of an engine. Headlights, two perfect round circles of blinding white light, pinning her in their glare like a terrified animal. They were at the end of the dirt track, blocking the only way out. The truck door slammed shut, a sound of brutal finality that echoed in the silent clearing. Then another. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching on the gravel. More than one person. They weren't coming to talk. She scrambled backwards, dragging the heavy box with her, her mind a screaming siren of pure panic. They had been waiting. They had been watching her. The visit to Silas, the trip to the well. It had all been a trap, and she had walked right into it, led by a desperate hope that had just been extinguished. She stared, mesmerized by the approaching headlights, as a dark shape detached itself from the glare. A man carrying a red can. Even from a distance, she could smell it. The sharp, acrid, unmistakable scent of gasoline. He walked to the front corner of the cabin, the corner where she and Leo slept, and began to splash the liquid liberally onto the dry, ancient wood. The smell was overpowering, a nauseating perfume of doom. A second man appeared, a silhouette against the blinding lights. He was holding a lighter. The tiny, flickering flame was impossibly bright in the darkness. He flicked it once. A spark. He touched it to the gasoline-soaked wall. There was a low whoosh, a sound like a giant beast inhaling, and the corner of the cabin erupted in a furious explosion of orange and yellow flame. The fire spread with terrifying speed, licking its way up the dry timber, devouring 30 years of decay in a matter of seconds. The heat was instantaneous and intense, a physical blow that drove her back. The crackle of the flames was a hungry, living sound, punctuated by the sharp pop of heating wood and the hiss of sap boiling. Thick, black smoke began to pour from the hole in the roof, choking the stars. Inside, Leo. The thought cut through her paralysis like a shard of ice. Leo. The men were making no move to go inside. They stood back, their faces illuminated by the growing inferno, watching the fire do their work for them. They intended to burn them alive, to erase them, to turn them into just another tragic mountain story. But they didn't know she was already outside, and they had made the same mistake Alarico had made 30 years ago. They had left a witness. Grabbing the box of evidence, her mind a frantic blur of instinct, she scrambled away from the light of the fire, melting back into the shadows. She raced around to the back of the cabin, her heart a wild, frantic bird trapped in her chest. The fire was growing, a roaring, monstrous beast. "Leo!" she screamed, her voice raw with terror. "Leo! Wake up! Get out!" There was no response, only the hungry roar of the fire. She reached the back wall, a section not yet touched by the flames. She found the window to his small sleeping area, its frame rotted. Without a second's hesitation, she slammed her shoulder into it. The rotted wood splintered and gave way, and she half fell, half tumbled into the smoke-filled room. The heat was immense. The air was thick and black, stinging her eyes, filling her lungs with poison. She dropped to the floor, crawling, shouting his name. "Leo!" She found him huddled under the blanket, awake, paralyzed with terror, coughing in the thick smoke. She grabbed him, her hands rough, desperate. "Come on, we have to go. Now!" she screamed over the roar of the flames. She practically dragged him towards the broken window. Outside, she could hear the men shouting, their voices laced with confusion. They must have heard her screams, realized the cabin wasn't empty, and that their plan was going wrong. She shoved Leo through the window first, into the cold night air. He landed in the dirt, coughing and gasping. She tossed the heavy evidence box out after him. Then she clambered through the splintered opening just as a section of the roof collapsed inward with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks and flaming embers into the night sky. She grabbed a terrified, sobbing Leo with one hand and the handle of the metal box with the other. They couldn't go towards the road. They had only one option, one destination, one hope for sanctuary. She plunged into the darkness of the forest, back the way she had come, towards the warm, flickering light of Silas's cabin. The sounds of pursuit were immediate behind them. "They're in the woods! Get them!" The shouts were followed by the crash of bodies moving through the undergrowth, the snap of branches. The hunt had begun. Ilara ran, her lungs burning, her legs pumping on pure adrenaline. She dragged Leo along, his small legs struggling to keep up. The heavy metal box banged against her thigh with every stride, a painful, constant reminder of the prize she carried and the reason they were being hunted. The woods, which had been her cloak, were now a treacherous maze. The flames from the burning cabin cast long, dancing, monstrous shadows that seemed to grab at them, to slow them down. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She just ran, her entire universe shrinking to the next tree, the next breath, and the desperate, frantic hope for survival. They burst into the tiny cabin, not as neighbors, but as refugees from a war zone. The smell of smoke and terror clung to them. Ilara, no, Sophia, half carried, half dragged a sobbing Leo, collapsing just inside the door. She dropped the heavy metal box on the rough-hewn table with a definitive, echoing thud. It was an anchor, a testament, a bomb. Silas needed only one look at the inferno lighting up the night sky where the Serrano cabin once stood, at the raw terror etched on Sophia's face, and at the mud-streaked evidence box sitting on his table. The guilt and fear that had paralyzed him for 3 decades fell away, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. He didn't waste time on questions or comfort. With the slow, deliberate movements of a man performing a sacred rite, he shuffled to the corner where an ancient ham radio sat, its bakelite shell gleaming in the lamplight. He flicked a switch, a low hum filled the room, and the vacuum tubes began to glow with a warm, amber light, a fragile promise of connection to a world beyond their burning mountain. The hiss of static filled the room, a sound like a rushing river of ghosts. Silas held the microphone, his knuckles white, his hand trembling not with age, but with the weight of this single, final act of courage. He spoke into the receiver, his voice a dry, cracking whisper that held the iron-hard certainty of truth. "This is Blackwood," he rasped, giving a call sign unused for 30 years. "I'm calling for Prosecutor Almeida. It's about the Serrano case." He waited, the static hissing its reply. Sophia held her breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Then, a voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear. "Silas, my God, is that you?" It was Almeida's deputy. The prosecutor himself had retired, but his legacy of justice remained. Silas didn't falter. "I have it," he said, his voice gaining strength. "The evidence, all of it. Bastos is burning the mountain down as we speak. His men are hunting them." There was a pause, a moment of decision that stretched into an eternity. Then the voice returned, stripped of all disbelief. "Stay put. Don't move. Help is coming." Dawn. The wait was the purest form of torture. The fire on the mountain eventually died down, leaving a gaping black wound in the night, a smoking pyre for Sophia's phantom past. Inside the small, warm cabin, a different kind of fire burned, the low, flickering flame of desperate hope. Sophia cleaned the soot from Leo's face with a damp rag, her movements slow and tender. He had cried himself to sleep in her arms, his small body exhausted by a terror no child should ever know. Silas sat by the radio, a silent, unmoving sentinel, as if expecting Alarico's men to burst through the door at any moment. The air was thick with the scent of old books, wood smoke, and the faint, coppery smell of adrenaline. Sophia ran her trembling fingers over the cold metal of the evidence box. It was no longer just her father's legacy. It was her husband's vindication, her son's future, and her own rebirth. She had drawn the truth up from a well of darkness, and now she could only pray that the light it cast would be enough to save them from the monsters it had exposed. Dawn did not creep. It shattered. The first sign was not light, but sound. a deep, rhythmic chopping that grew from a distant murmur into a powerful, earth-shaking thrum. It wasn't the sound of Alarico's rumbling truck. This was the sound of authority, of intervention. A sleek, black helicopter crested the ridge, its silhouette stark against the pale, pink and orange sky. It circled Silas's small clearing once, a hawk assessing its territory, before roaring off towards the sprawling estate of Alarico Bastos. Moments later, a second helicopter followed, and then a third. Simultaneously, down on the main road, a convoy of unmarked black SUVs, vehicles that had never before sullied these mountain roads, moved with silent, professional speed, their purpose absolute. They bypassed the sleepy local police station entirely. The message was clear. This was not a local matter. This was a federal reckoning. For the first time in 30 years, a power greater than Alarico had come to Shadow Ridge, and it had come for him. Alarico Bastos was enjoying his morning coffee on the veranda of his mansion, a sprawling monument to his stolen empire, when the world ended. The sound of the approaching helicopters barely registered over the chirping of birds in his manicured gardens. By the time he looked up, it was too late. Federal agents, clad in black tactical gear, swarmed his property with a terrifying, silent efficiency. They poured from the helicopters and SUVs, a tide of retribution he could not stop. He was halfway to his feet, a protest forming on his lips, when they seized him. The pristine white shirt he had worn as a costume of patriarchal benevolence was twisted in the grip of a stern-faced agent. The fear in his eyes, the sudden, complete shock of a predator who has never known fear, was a sight 30 years in the making. They read him his rights against the backdrop of the smoldering mountain, his empire collapsing around him as swiftly and completely as the Serrano cabin had burned in the night. The patriarch was dethroned. Sophia, the name felt solid now. A foundation, not a ghost, sat in a clean, brightly lit office far from the mountain. The air smelled of coffee and bureaucracy, a scent she found profoundly comforting. The metal box sat on a polished mahogany table, its contents laid out like the sacred relics of a murdered saint. Investigators, legal experts, and historians pored over the ledgers, their hushed, reverent whispers confirming what she already knew. This was the truth. It was undeniable. She gave her statement, her voice clear and steady, the story flowing out of her not as a jumble of trauma, but as a coherent, damning narrative. They restored her identity, the legal paperwork a formality that paled in comparison to the internal shift she had already undergone. When the lead prosecutor, a woman with kind, intelligent eyes, addressed her for the first time as Ms. Serrano, a single, hot tear rolled down Sophia's cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of reclamation. The ghost had finally come home. The trials were a sensation, ripping the mask of civility from the face of the region. Alarico Bastos, the benevolent doctor, was exposed as a monster, a sociopath whose greed had carved a path of destruction through generations. The ledgers and deeds from the well were irrefutable. One by one, his cronies, including the 2 men who had set the cabin ablaze, turned on him in exchange for lighter sentences, their loyalty as shallow as the graves they had helped him fill. Alarico was convicted on multiple counts of murder, fraud, arson, and racketeering. The sentence was life, without the possibility of parole. He would die in a cage, a fate he had architected for so many others. More importantly, the courts used the recovered evidence to begin the slow, arduous process of restorative justice. Land stolen decades ago was returned to the grandchildren of its rightful owners. The mountain, so long held hostage by a single man's evil, was finally being given back to its people. The cycle of fear was broken. The legal system, for all its slowness, moved with surprising speed in the case of Sophia Serrano. As the sole proven heir of Marcus and Lena Serrano, she was legally entitled to reclaim the entirety of her parents' original estate, a vast tract of valuable mountain land that Alarico had fraudulently folded into his own holdings. The monetary value was staggering. A figure with so many zeros it seemed like a misprint. It was a fortune built on timber, on mineral rights, on the very beauty of the land her parents had loved and died for. She was no longer a destitute widow counting her last $100. She was one of the wealthiest women in the state. The money, however, was secondary. It was a tool, not a goal. It was the means to rebuild, to create, to secure a future for Leo so bright and safe that it would burn away the shadows of the past forever. It was the ultimate irony. The fortune Alarico had killed to protect had ultimately ended up in the hands of the one person he had tried so hard to erase. A year later, the scent of fresh-cut cedar and baking bread filled the crisp mountain air. Where the rotted skeleton of a cabin had once stood, a new house rose. It was not a mansion but a home, crafted from wood and stone and glass, designed to embrace the landscape, not dominate it. Inside, the sound was not the drip of a leaky tap, but the happy hum of a state-of-the-art sewing machine. Sophia sat before it, not mending rags out of desperation, but creating a beautiful, intricate quilt, the vibrant colors a stark contrast to the grey misery of her former life. Her fingers, once raw and pricked, moved with joyful purpose. A golden retriever puppy, a new addition to their family, chased a ball across a sun-drenched lawn where Leo, now 11, laughed with a freedom she had once thought impossible. The sound of his laughter, pure and untroubled, was the sweetest music she had ever heard. It was the sound of a curse being broken. It was the sound of peace. That evening, she set the table for three. Silas, now a beloved grandfather figure, sat by the crackling fire, telling Leo stories of the mountain's true magic. The table itself was a portrait of abundance, laden with roasted chicken, fresh vegetables from their own garden, and warm bread. It was a universe away from the stale crackers and creek water that had marked their arrival. As Sophia carved the chicken, she caught her reflection in the glass of the window. She saw a woman she almost didn't recognize, her face no longer etched with fear and hunger, but with a quiet, powerful serenity. She looked at Leo, his face glowing in the warm light, and then at Silas, his eyes twinkling with a hard-won peace. This was her family. This was her home. They had not just survived, they had triumphed. Her parents' sacrifice had not been in vain. Their story, and hers, was proof that even in the deepest darkness, a single spark of courage could be enough to bring the dawn. If you believe that stories of resilience and justice deserve to be told, subscribe for more tales of the human spirit's refusal to be broken.